Kind introduction, and Simon also for your remarks. It's great to be here in New Brunswick. I'm going to talk about mostly tropical systems today. I thought this would be something pretty different for y'all here, but the way the weather feels outside today, I feel like I'm in the tropics. I didn't need to bring a coat with me, I guess. Supposedly it's going to get colder. I don't know. Okay, so what I'm going to do today, I'm going to give a fairly general talk and mostly address questions, and the questions may not all have answers, and then I'll sprinkle in what I think may be some evidence addressing those questions. And so here's the first one. Oh, it did that by itself. Oh no, it didn't. There we go. First, an observation. The focus here is going to be on the pulsing nature of lowland river floodplain ecosystems. But really, if you think about it, all ecosystems have some degree of pulsing that occurs in at least abiotic environmental drivers and a lot of the biotic components. We have winter and summer and high latitude areas, montane areas, and so on. And this is obviously important for us to understand how this influences ecological dynamics, because after all, the objective of the science of ecology is to be able to make predictions about things. This is from a review paper by Louis Yang et al., where they address resource pulses in ecology. And thanks, Scott. And they define resource pulses as availability increases that are short duration, large magnitude, and are relatively infrequent. And I actually feel like this is too strict of a definition. I think that there's probably a broad continuum of pulsing that occurs in nature. But they point out that at least with regard to resource pulses, they're usually driven by climatic type factors, abiotic factors, rainfall, flooding, so on. There can be an accumulation in space of resources and then a pulse of release in space. And we often see this kind of dynamic in floodplain systems. And then, of course, population outbreak dynamics, like insect outbreaks and so on, represent resource pulses for the organisms that consume those insects. And they point out that pulsing affects ecological processes at the level of individual organisms, populations, and community levels, but I would add certainly ecosystem level as well. So here's the first question, a hypothesis. Strongly pulsing ecosystems have higher productivity with greater resilience to human disturbance than ecosystems that are less variable. So what might be some evidence in support of that viewpoint? Let's look at fisheries, major marine fisheries. Some of the most productive fisheries on the planet that sustain very, very high levels of harvest are areas that have pulsing dynamics, like the Peruvian anchoveta fishery off the coast of Peru in South America. It's an upwelling area, and there's a lot of variation in the delivery of nutrients and primary and secondary productivity that result. As opposed to a tropical coral reef system, where you have a lot of diversity, incredible diversity, but these systems are not particularly resilient to human impacts like harvesting fishes. In fact, they're quite sensitive, as it turns out. And you can go through a major regime shift just by eliminating, for example, the large-bodied fish, the predatory fish from the system. If we look at freshwater fisheries, we have systems, and I'll talk about these more in a moment, in the tropics, river systems like the Amazon, where they're huge in fisheries, and then fisheries in places like Lake Tanganyika in the Rift Valley of East Africa, important fishery there, but it's a much more stable ecosystem. It's near the equator, it's a lentic environment, it's much less dynamic and less pulsing in nature than a tropical river system. This is from a review by Robin Welcome a few years ago, where he looks at inland fishery statistics. And what I'm pointing at here is that the yield in terms of kilograms of fish yield per hectare is much, much higher in smaller lakes than larger lakes. There's an inverse relationship with lake size. And most of the small lakes that these data are coming from are in floodplain regions. They're small, shallow lakes. They're subjected to the hydrological dynamics of the fluvial system. And if we look at rivers and compare rivers, obviously on a global scale, much of the harvest is coming from actually one river. This is probably the Amazon here. That's the largest river. So there's a direct relationship with rivers, with river size. It's pretty logical. So the point is that large floodplain rivers, including the aquatic habitats of the floodplain, are incredibly productive habitats. This is from a paper we did a few years ago where we compared the change in the value of the fish catch for the upper Paraná River in southern Brazil. It's a big river floodplain area where they built a huge dam, the Itaipu Reservoir. When the dam was constructed, it was the largest hydroelectric project on Earth. It's since been surpassed by the Three Gorges Dam in China. So I think it's second largest now. But what we did is we indexed the value of the fish catch, and you see that after the dam came in, there was a huge drop-off from what it had once been when it was a free-flowing river and with the productive floodplain. So inland fisheries are incredibly important in the tropical world. We have inland fisheries in Canada, in the US. It's mostly recreational fishing for the most part, which is valuable, but people don't really depend that much on freshwater fish for their nutritional needs in this part of the world. But in the tropics, it's a different story. So these are just some shots from the western Amazon in Peru, the Orinoco River in Venezuela. We did research in Venezuela for a long time before conditions got pretty tough in that country. The Niger River, some of you may not realize that the Niger River in West Africa supports one of the largest inland fisheries on the planet. It's a semi-arid region, but there's a big inland delta, that floodplain that supports a fishery. Much of the fish is smoked and sold as smoked fish. You see here. The Ganga River, the Ganges in India, huge fishery. You don't find many of these large fish anymore. It's a very, very intense fishery. And then in recent years I've been working with colleagues on the Mekong River in Cambodia. This is probably the most intense fishery I've ever seen in my life. It's unbelievable, the amount of effort, the variety of methods that are used, and the amount of fish that they pull out of the rivers and floodplain lakes in the system. A lot of the fish is sold fresh. Historically, there were some very large, you hear about megafish, right? These TV shows about megafish, monster fish. The Mekong has some huge species like the giant Mekong catfish that is now almost extinct in the wild, nearly extinct. Those are almost gone because of that high fishing pressure. So, question here is, does this annual flood pulsing that we see in tropical floodplain river ecosystems promote productivity that allows these fisheries to be sustainable? Because it's confusing to me that they can continue this level of harvest even today, notwithstanding there have been obvious impacts to the structure of the fish communities. The rarity of very large species is a problem. But these rivers are still producing protein at a pretty impressive level. So there are some theories. Some of you probably know Kevin McCann at University of Guelph and Joe Rasmussen. McCann and colleagues have done a number of theoretical papers on food web dynamics. And in this one, they talk about how spatial coupling of food web subcomponents can actually result in greater stability of the overall system. So this is compartmentation in space that they're talking about. And the link between the compartments that they focus on in this paper is large mobile consumers that move between compartments and link them. But I talked to Kevin about this idea, and there's no reason that this concept doesn't work also in time as well as space, right? We can compartment the dynamics of the system and the interactions in terms of spatial or temporal units as well as spatial units. And Kevin said that's totally reasonable to think about food webs in that manner. So this is what pulsing does. We have compartmentation in time where species interactions are occurring perhaps in a different configuration during these different temporal compartments. So what they found was that consumers link these spatial components of food webs, and that linkage influences food web dynamics, and it imparts a degree of stability to the system. And also that these mobile organisms are the stabilizers. And to me, this whole model fits with river floodplain systems that have pulsing dynamics. And the reason it fits so well is because there's a complete interaction between time and space in how organisms use habitat in river floodplains, the floodplains especially. So river floodplains, not only in the tropics, here in Canada as well, they're mosaics of varied habitats. And also they're very dynamic habitats. And what's driving a lot of that dynamics is hydrology, variable hydrology. So here's a study by some colleagues in Argentina on the lower reach of the Rio Paraná, the same one I mentioned where they built the Itaipu Reservoir. In the lower part, there's a huge expanse of floodplain in Argentina before the river empties to the Atlantic. And it's a habitat mosaic. I think you can get a feel from that, from this figure. And they studied fish assemblages during different periods of the flood pulses in that floodplain, in the river channel and in floodplain lentic habitats. And what they found is you get different assemblages of species locally interacting during different periods of the flood cycle in different locations, river channel versus floodplain lakes and lagoons, and much more variability in the floodplain. So you've got these little spatial compartments of interacting species as a food web subcomponent, but they're linked. And they're linked dynamically in accordance with the pulsing flood cycle. So next I want to talk about how annual flood pulsing in the tropics influences the performance of fish and some of the ecosystem dynamics. And the first thing is, for certain consumers, like these predatory peacock bass, and this is from a study we did in Venezuela in the Llanos region, that's in the Orinoco River Basin. These are predatory fish, voracious predators. They're popular sport fish in South America. In the Sinaruco River where we did this study, there's actually 3 species. This one, Cyclotemensis, gets much larger than the other 2. Temensis and Orinocensis use a wide range of habitats in the system. They're in the river channel, they're in floodplain lagoons, abundant in both of those areas. This one, Cycla intermedia, is restricted to the river channel. we rarely find it, very rarely, in lagoon-type habitats in the floodplain. And what I'm showing you here is that the size of prey that they're consuming based on gut contents analysis is significantly larger during the period of the annual flood cycle when the water level is dropping. And what's happening is fish are becoming more concentrated in space. And so it becomes easier for predators to find prey. And also, coming out of the wet season, when the whole region is flooded, a huge area of floodplain is flooded, a lot of the fish have reproduced during that flood period. And now we have all this new young of the year fish production concentrated in shrinking aquatic habitat. So they're feeding preferentially on the larger prey during this period. Hunting is good for predatory fish during this period. But as the water level continues to drop to the very low water period, they start to deplete the preferred prey sizes, and they have to shift to smaller size prey that are less profitable. And then when the water rises, the fish become dispersed again, and hunting becomes more difficult. And then the cycle repeats the next year. And here's further evidence of the same phenomenon, where this is where the water's falling. It's still falling, and we get into the peak of the low water on this end of these graphs. And these are for different rivers in the Llanos region for the two species that are widespread. And the same phenomenon is observed in multiple floodplain rivers in the Llanos region. Other species of fish, other trophic gills, for example, seed and fruit-eating fishes in the Amazon, have their time of plenty during the high water period. So if you feed on seeds and fruits, the best time for you is when the forest is flooded and you have access to the resources that are out there in the flooded forest. And that's exactly what we found in a study done in the western Amazon in Colombia. This was work done by my graduate student Bibiana Correa in Colombia. And what you're seeing on this graph is the seasonal cycle. We've got time. This is the high water period, the falling water period, and the peak low water period in this system. And then the lines are the relative availability of various food resources. The one I want you to pay attention to is the dark line. That's for fruits and seeds. And then the black circles is the consumption of fruits and seeds. So they're consuming more fruits and seeds during the high water period when that resource is more available. And Bibiana measured availability of fruits and seeds by doing a lot of work. She went out into the flooded forest and put out plastic sheets suspended on ropes to catch what was falling out of the forest towards the water, and then she could quantify availability. So depending on the niche, the trophic niche, the time of plenty and the time of scarcity may differ. Okay, so there's also this phenomenon of varying amounts of aquatic habitat available to aquatic organisms during the annual flood pulse. This was a study done by colleagues again in Brazil on the Upper Paraná floodplain region. This is a group in Brazil that's been doing long-term research of varied components of this ecosystem for, well, even before 1986. But long-term monitoring, which is a rare thing to find in ecology. I heard today about some of this sort of research that's being conducted right here. And that's a wonderful thing because there's so much you can do with long-term data sets. And what they looked at here was the abundance, the catch per unit effort of fish in different functional groups based on the mobility of the fish. So you have long-distance migratory species, short distance migrators that just make local migrations on a seasonal basis, and then relatively sedentary fish that don't move all that far. And they broke this down into 3 time periods where we had no flooding, or very little annual flood pulse, a moderate flood pulse, and then a normal, fairly large flood pulse. And you see that flood pulsing really benefited the long distance migrators and the sedentary species. It also benefited the short distance migrators compared to where you don't have flooding, and then the moderate flooding seemed to promote abundance of short migrators. So there's a real response in terms of population dynamics to this pulsing phenomenon. It seems to be incredibly important for the productivity of the system, of the fisheries. Another aspect of pulsing, hydrological pulsing in tropical rivers, and I'm sure it's not only in the tropics, it's probably a global phenomenon, is the way that it influences decomposition dynamics and nutrient dynamics in the ecosystem. And so what you tend to get in the tropics at least is during the wet season, during the high water period, is a buildup of aquatic macrophytes. And then as the water level drops, there's a lot of die-off of this vegetation and decomposition and then nutrient cycling that ensues. This is the Sinaruco River I mentioned where we did one of those Peacock Bass studies, an area where we've done research. I don't know, we probably have over 15 years of studies on the Sinaruco River. It's a beautiful river. It's in the Llanos region of Venezuela, but it's in a watershed that's kind of different from most of the Llanos in that it's very nutrient poor, sandy soils. The rivers don't have really any significant communication with the Andes Mountains to the west, like most of the other rivers do in the Llanos. And so that's why the soils are very sandy. There's not much clay that's brought down from the mountains. This is what it looks like from the air. That's the Orinoco River at the top of the screen. This is the Sinaruco, meandering floodplain river. All this terrain floods in the wet season. Virtually everything you can see here would be underwater, very shallow, but nonetheless flooded. It has a dense gallery forest surrounded by grassland savanna. As I mentioned, it's very nutrient poor. Look at this conductivity. I mean, that's almost like distilled water. Very low in solutes and minerals, has a fairly low pH. Very clear water. And what I want you to notice is how clean the sand is on the bottom of the river channel. You almost don't see anything green in the river during the dry season, which perplexed us when we first went to study the system. Usually we would do our research in the dry season because that's when the site's most accessible, and also it's the time of year when it's easiest to catch fish because they're concentrated. The wet season is not a particularly good time to be there studying fish. But there's no algae, there's no aquatic macrophytes, there's not much green stuff in the water. What's supporting the food web? It has a very, very regular annual pulsing hydrograph. Every year looks pretty much the same. The magnitude will vary a little bit from year to year. The timing slightly from year to year, but year in and year out, it's a very regular hydrology and very pulsing. And in the wet season, of course, you get the flooding. The fish are dispersed, so they're at low per unit area densities. And there's a very important fish in the system. There's about 280 species of fish we've documented from this river. And it's not a particularly large river, it's a tributary. But one fish is very abundant in the dry season, and it's a migratory fish. It leaves the system during the wet season. In fact, just as the rains start and the water level starts inching upward, these fish school up and migrate downstream, and they go to the Orinoco. And they spawn out on the floodplains of the Orinoco, and they remain there throughout the wet season. It's the nursery for their young. And then as water levels drop out on the Orinoco, they migrate en masse back into clear water rivers like the Sinaruco. And they become one of the most abundant species in the system during the dry season, certainly in terms of biomass. And you do see some growth of aquatic macrophytes, and you do see some accumulation of organic sediments in patches during the wet season. In the dry season, everything's the opposite, and the migratory fish are back in the system during the dry season. So this is that fish that I just described. The locals call it the boca chico. I don't know, little boy's mouth or something. They call it that because it has fleshy lips. And it has fleshy lips because they feed, they're benthivorous fish. They feed on fine particulate organic matter on sediment, on the substrate. And they use these fleshy lips to just kind of go along and vacuum up the dirt off the bottom of the river, basically. And that's what they eat. They're detritivores. And so we came up with this theory that maybe what's happening is we're getting this alternation of top-down control of benthic resources, basal resources, algae and fine particulate organic matter that accumulates on surfaces on the bottom of the river and in lagoons is allowed to accumulate in the wet season because this fish is absent from the system, and it doesn't accumulate when we have this strong top-down control by this grazing detritivorous fish that's migratory. So we tested this with field experiments. We built cages, and some were enclosures where we could put the boca chicos inside. Some excluded only large fish, but the mesh was big enough to let the little fish pass in and out. We had control areas, and then total fish exclosures, where the mesh was fine and it excluded virtually all the fish. So we could see if there's an effect of little fish that are resident or these large migratory fish. We could sort that out. And this is what we found during the dry season. So this is the accumulation of chlorophyll A on tiles that we put inside the cages. And so the prediction we had, if there is indeed a dominant effect of this migratory fish on the accumulation of organic matter on the substrate, we should see the enclosure matching the control. Where we put the grazing fish inside should look pretty much like the rest of the river. And where we exclude them, we should get a big buildup of organic matter and chlorophyll, and that's what we see here. And if it's the case that other fish aren't having much effect, this treatment should pretty much match that treatment. If these two match, if this isn't any higher, then it's mainly this one species of fish that's probably having this influence, and not the entire community of grazing fish. And we did replicates in the river channel, in lagoons. We did this during different phases of the hydrological cycle. In the wet season, we found almost no fish effect, a slight effect of the small resident fish, but no effect of the migratory fish because they're absent from the system during the wet season. Another aspect to explore in why these diverse tropical river fish communities are so resilient, apparently, could be the influence of life history diversity and a phenomenon that's been called the storage effect. So this is a model of life history evolution that I came up with, and in conjunction with Kenny Rose, we further developed this idea of how fishes, this started with fish, freshwater and marine fish, but I think the model extends to virtually every kind of living organism. It's not unique to fish. where it's a triangular continuum of strategies. So it's a continuum. There can be intermediates, but in one extreme we have what we've called the equilibrium strategist. If you're familiar with R and K strategy ideas, this is the K strategy. We have small species that we call opportunistic strategists, essentially R strategists. These are species that have high reproductive effort. They mature at small sizes. They have short generation times, short lifespans, typically. And then we have this group, which if you read the theoretical life history literature, this is the strategy that you don't run across very often. But it's probably the predominant strategy of life on Earth, at least metazoan life on Earth. Species that delay maturation until they get to a sufficiently large size to realize a high fecundity, that produce lots and lots of eggs or tiny propagules in a given reproductive bout. So this is what most fish do, you know, this is what cod do, and this is what lobsters do, and a lot of trees do this, right? Lots of organisms do this, and the question is why? So this has been promoted as a colonizing strategy. It turns out that this strategy is the most efficient way to increase the intrinsic rate of increase of a population. So if you want to build up your population rapidly, mature early, and have high reproductive effort, live fast and die young, right? That's the best way to build up your numbers. The R strategy. This strategy, I mean, the logical explanation for it throughout the life history literature is that it allows you to be more competitive in a crowded community, a saturated community. Maybe a community that is in a relatively stable habitat. The K strategy. But what's with this one? You know, why are trees doing this? Why are lobsters and cod doing this? So these are fish from the Mekong River that I've got pictured here. And the idea we have is that this strategy exploits large-scale variation in space and or time. I initially called it the seasonal life history strategy because it was most obvious in tropical fish that have short spawning seasons and produce huge batches of eggs that are scattered into the river without any parental care like you find in this group. Usually parental care is well developed here. Here it's not. So you just produce lots of propagules and you throw them out there and you hope some of them make it, right? That's the strategy, the periodic strategy. And it seems to benefit species that can exploit large-scale variation in the environment. So springtime is a good time to put your seeds out there, right? Or during the flood period, when predator densities are lowest. So there's this idea in the ecological literature of the storage effect. And the person that's really promoted this is Peter Chesson, a theoretical ecologist. And Chesson has shown that we can get greater stability and coexistence in competing species in a variable environment if there's a storage effect. And the storage effect can be manifested in different forms. I'll get to that in a moment. But it seems to me, when I think about Chesson's storage effect, we have very little storage effect embodied in this strategy. There's a whole lot in the periodic strategy because they're long-lived organisms. So there's a lot of reproductive potential that's stored up in the soma of a long-lived organism. So it's a bet hedging strategy where there are going to be multiple attempts at successful reproduction, at fitness for the individual, in an environment with sufficiently large-scale variation. And then there's going to be a moderate storage effect in this strategy. And so, according to Chesson and colleagues, when the strength of competition co-varies with environmental conditions, the storage effect can enhance coexistence of species. Well, this is exactly what we get. You know, I described to you how fruit availability varies with variation in environmental conditions in the Amazon, for example. When there's a decoupling of species that arises from partially uncorrelated responses to that environmental variation. So we have this variation in life history strategies of species that coexist. And then we have mechanisms such as seed banks among plants. There are actually some animals that do the same thing. Annual killifish in the tropics are basically producing a seed bank. Long-lived adults represents a storage effect, and things like storing fat that can be converted into energy for reproduction also represents the storage effect. There are a number of ways it can be embodied in different organisms. So I think the storage effect really applies to tropical fish communities that are very diverse, where you have a lot of different functional traits and ecological strategies represented in the communities. And there, of course, are limits. So I described how resilient these fisheries are, but I also alluded to the fact that the giant Mekong catfish is almost extinct now. So there are limits to this resilience that I'm hypothesizing here. And what we're seeing in a lot of inland fisheries in the tropics is this shift in the composition of the fish communities. So they're still producing a lot of fish biomass year in and year out with very intensive fishing effort. So this is from the Mekong. So people are no longer catching the giant carp anymore. I mean, if you're trying to make your living selling giant carp, you're not going to do very well because there just aren't anymore. And they're catching these small fish, a fish called the tray riel, and selling it either as whole fish, smoked fish, or fish paste. They grind it up, they're like minnows basically. And they grind it up into fish paste, and you can store that in a jar, and it keeps for a long time, and people eat that. So this has been called the fishing down phenomenon. This is again from Robin Welcome. And the idea is that when you first develop a fishery, you know, the most high valued species are generally the large species. They're targeted first, and as those are depleted, the fishery shifts to medium-sized fish, next most valuable, and as those get depleted, you fish down to the small fish, and before you know it, you're mostly catching minnows, and everybody's eating minnows. But the point is, you're still producing fish biomass. It's just different biomass. And in the tropics, in developing countries, in the tropical region, most people are very happy to eat this. I mean, if you don't have an alternative, that's what you'll eat. So some other questions to pose. Small fish with resilient populations are also food for larger fish. And the larger fish have the capacity for this storage effect that the small fish don't have. And also, there's a high potential for recruitment variation in large fish because of that high fecundity and the large spatial and temporal variation that high fecundity is designed to exploit. You have the potential for big swings in recruitment success for those populations of these periodic species. But they're feeding on, the predatory ones are feeding on small fish that have a different life history strategy that's more resilient. So, does flood pulsing, this is just a question that I'm wondering, does it result in a sequential ratcheting up of biomass that's stored in larger and larger bodied fishes that imparts some stability to the whole fish community, or at least the biomass, the standing biomass? So here's the idea. You have a food web. This is a very simplistic rendition of a river floodplain food web. But, you know, you've got your nutrients and your primary producers and various kinds of fish guilds, and leading all the way to humans that harvest fish. So we put humans in the food web. But these are small-bodied organisms towards the base of this aquatic food web, and you get successively larger and longer-lived organisms as you work your way up towards the humans. And there could be a ratcheting up of standing biomass in this food web that occurs due to the storage effect and the life history strategies of species that occupy different trophic levels. So the idea is you have consumption, this is the food web going up trophic levels in the food web with the red arrows, and then you have accumulation of biomass that occurs over the annual flood pulse at each level. And then when you get to the top, you've got increasing stability of that standing biomass. Now this is in a natural system that's unexploited. So what would happen in an unexploited system is you're going to get a buildup of biomass at the top due to the storage effect and the periodic strategy that most of the fish at that level have, compared to species lower in the food web that tend to be shorter lived, more resilient to harvest. They're being harvested in the natural system by predators. And so when we exploit these systems and when we fish it down, we fish back down to this level where we're dealing with very resilient species, so they can withstand the harvesting that we're doing because that's what they're designed for. And we can keep fishing, but again, it's a very different composition of that fishery. The last question I'm going to pose to you, and I'm not sure I know the answer to this, but I suspect that oligotrophic systems, nutrient-poor systems that have low primary productivity are less resilient to harvest, to fishing. And one thing that makes me think this is an experience I had in Venezuela, in the very south of Venezuela. We did a series of expeditions. It was mostly back in the early and mid-1990s. In the very south of Venezuela, near the border with Brazil, there's a region called it's the Cassiquiare Canal, the Cassiquiare watershed. It's a river that connects the headwaters of the Orinoco River to the headwaters of the Rio Negro. The Rio Negro flows to the Amazon in Brazil. The Orinoco flows through the Llanos in Venezuela out to the Caribbean. So in theory, I'd always heard about the Cassiquiare and read about it, and I thought it was so cool that in theory a fish could swim from the delta of the Orinoco, up the Orinoco, down the Cassiquiare, down the Rio Negro to the Amazon, and to the mouth of the Amazon. Because the Cassiquiare is a pretty big river, at least the lower part. So I always wanted to see this place. And Humboldt, the famous naturalist and explorer, Alexander von Humboldt, explored the Cassiquiare. So we did this. We went there as teams and we just were surveying. But we went and into this Blackwater River. It's a tributary of the Cassiquiare, the Pasamoni. Extreme black water. I mean, from a distance the water looks like cappuccino coffee. I mean, it's black. You get up close and it's actually, you know, brown, very dark tea stain. And the sand is white. So it's like, you know, you got these sandbanks that look like sugar, granulated sugar, and then coffee. Really bizarre river. But the first time we went there, in '93, this is my colleague, Agnello Barberino. We both like to fish with rod and reel. The peacock bass were all huge. There were a lot of Cyclotenensis and not many of the other species. And they were gigantic, every single one of them that we caught. I think we only got one fish that was less than, I think it was like 16 pounds. They were all between like 16 and 25. It blew my mind. It's like, where are the little fish? we weren't used to seeing stocks with that size structure. And I thought, this is what an unfished natural population of peacock bass looks like. And there's few places on Earth where you could go and see something like that. So this is a very remote region. It's hard to get to. And then we went back. You know, we did a series of these expeditions. I'm like, let's go back up into the Passamoni, you know, check it out. And, you know, in just a short time, 5 years. So in the time since we first went there, sports fishermen had discovered this place. In fact, I first heard about it when I read an article in the Dallas Morning News newspaper about these guys from Texas that went down there and claimed to be the first, you know, non-native people to ever fish on this river, and the fish were all huge, and I'm like, wow, I gotta check that out. And it was true, the fish were all huge. But more people were getting in there, and it didn't take much fishing pressure, and all of a sudden things changed. They changed so rapidly. And it started to look more like the other rivers that we had seen. So the last question is, I've thrown out a bunch of ideas about, you know, pulsing ecosystems and river floodplain systems and their dynamics, and how life history strategies influence the resilience and stability of the fish communities. Is there some way to put this all together? How can you ever test the interrelationships of these ideas, right? And there probably isn't any one good way to do that, but one thing that we're working on right now is an ecosystem modeling approach. It's called an individual-based or agent-based model. It's a simulation model where you're basically simulating the lives and the fates of individual organisms on a daily time step. So it's a huge computer programming challenge, but I've got some outstanding colleagues that are talented in this. So I'm not doing the programming, we're just working together to build this thing. And we're doing it for the Upper Paraná River floodplain. So this is actually the last remaining stretch of free-flowing river, significant stretch on the Upper Paraná River in Brazil. All the rest of the basin's been dammed with hydroelectric dams. And so my colleagues at the Universidade Estadual de Maringá, they've got long-term research that's been going on there since the late 70s. And it's amazing. They've studied so many different components of this ecosystem. Not only fish and aquatic invertebrates, but vegetation, birds, a lot of different aspects, parasites. And so I thought, if there's a place where we could build a model like this, that's this complicated, and actually test it, because what good is a model? We were talking earlier today. You can make a model of anything, right? But if you can't test it, you don't know if you have anything worthwhile. They've got lots of data. So I'm working with the folks at that university, and we're building this model. And I think the beauty of it is if we can get some confidence in it and how it's performing, we can test a lot of different theories. Now we don't have to go to the field and do a huge experiment. Some experiments aren't even possible, right? We can simulate it with the model. And it's not that the model gives you truth. They never do, right? What's the saying? All models are wrong, but some are useful. Okay, so there you go. So that's it. I'll stop there, and if y'all have any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Before we go into questions, I just want to announce that Dr. Winemiller is giving the public lecture in Fredericton tonight at 7 o'clock, and it's a completely different lecture from this, so I encourage everybody to come and go up, as I will. There's posters all over for the location. Questions?
So one of the things when I see talking about pulsing, I feel like this has to be relevant to land managers. Because when I look at this, it feels to me like if I've got a really dynamic system, my policy probably has to be dynamic as well. Is it something that's going on with policy managers, that there's land managers are thinking about pulsing as something that might affect their?
I think not at this broad scale, kind of system level. I think it's probably kind of rare. I don't know. I may be wrong. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I know that there are many components of systems, like fire-driven vegetation dynamics, that people are very well aware of and use that in management. But in terms of looking at an entire system as a whole and applying it, the concepts to management, I can't think off the top of my head. Of course, I tend to think of aquatic examples. But you're right. You're absolutely right. There's one paper I like that I always have my graduate students read, and it was published like in '99 or something. And it's a short paper. It was just a note in, I think it was Oikos. And it caught my eye because it was really talking about this periodic life history strategy and what that strategy is adapted to exploit for the fitness of the organism. And it was talking about threatened vegetation species. So there are some plants that are very rare, and what we tend to do with rare things is we try to figure out what their habitat needs are, and then we try to protect a small place with the requirements and hands off, right? And for some plants, they point out, they require a disturbance regime of a certain magnitude and frequency, and if you take that away, they can't recruit. So that's this periodic strategy. That's the whole idea of the periodic strategy. It's that variation that's critical for the success of that life history strategy. And if you take it away, they're doomed.
Right. Yeah, because even when I was looking at one of your slides, and it was the one where you were talking about the migrants versus the short distance dispersers versus the long distance dispersers, and this idea that very abundant when floods occurred, not very abundant when floods weren't occurring. And you go, well, from a management point of view then, if you know we just had a flood, yeah, you can actually take lots of fish, because they're going to be dying anyway as the regime changes. They're going to be down to lower densities. You can take a bunch of fish. And when there's not flooding, we have to have a different kind of threshold. Yeah.
I'm not sure we're that far along in our thinking in fisheries management. But one area where this has entered in, okay, I should have come up with this first, is environmental flows. I don't know, for those of you who aren't familiar, this is the idea that we need to figure out what flow regime we need to retain in the river to support biodiversity and ecosystem services, processes. And that turns out to be a really hard thing to figure out. I see a few people nodding their heads, so you know how tough this is. Because each population, each species has its own requirement. There will be a component or regime that would be perfect for that population, but horrible for another one, but they coexist in the system. So the natural flow regime, we assume, provides what all of them need over the long term. But of course, we're manipulating flows, and we don't know how to put it back in the right way to support all of that diversity.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any habitat modifications that have occurred in these river systems as a result of moving from these large predators down to a more herbivorous group? I'm reminded of things like on coral reefs, and then the whole Yellowstone Park where you reintroduce the wolves, that changes how the river flows. Are the rivers changing as a consequence of the fish that are...
That's a really good question. So is there evidence, is there a case we can point to where the removal of the stock changed the very nature of the habitat?
Yeah, like you don't have the herbivores that are nipping away at the banks or eating the young shoots of the plants.
I can't think of any concrete evidence, but there's talk of the fruit-eating fish in the Amazon And I'm going to mention this in tonight's talk briefly, that they have the potential to influence riparian forest dynamics because there's some evidence they can be effective seed dispersants. And at first that was kind of controversial. It was first proposed by Michael Goulding back in 1979 in a book. And I always felt like, well, that's silly because most of these fish, like the one I showed in the slide, it's called the tambaqui. It's a big fish. They have these powerful jaws and malariform teeth, and they crush fruits and seeds. Well, that's not a very good seed disperser if they're crushing the seed. But there have been some studies done, and very recently, that show that, yeah, for some tree species, they're effective dispersers. And actually, germination is higher after it passes through the tambaqui's gut. And that's a very popular food fish. They're delicious. I guess because they feed on fruit, they have a very good flesh. And they've been depleted in some areas. So who knows? Time will tell. I don't know of any actual evidence that that's occurred. So that's one possible case. Well, there is a good, actually there is one good case study. Alex Flecker at Cornell University, his team was doing research for a number of years in Venezuela in a Piedmont river. It's a very small river in Venezuela, in the Piedmont of the Andes. And it has a different genus of migratory procylodonid fish like the one I talked about. Very similar, but it's a different genus. It's a genus that inhabits more whitewater, neutral pH type rivers. And they showed how that fish influences the benthic ecology in a very similar way. And that fish is exploited. And it's very vulnerable when it migrates up towards the Andes from the Llanos lowlands. And people can put gill nets right across the river and like catch virtually all of them and cut off their access to upstream areas. And Flecker showed how the absence of these fish changes the nutrient dynamics in the river. I think they looked at carbon dynamics. They actually used like radioactive tracers and quantified the actual flux and showed that when the fish aren't there, it's completely different. Significantly different, I'll say that. So that's one example I can think of.
I was curious about your example of comparing coral reefs to these inland fisheries in the tropics. And to what extent do you think the fact that I think almost all the examples you gave involve floodplains, and you talk about the fish dissipating or moving out, basically the habitat gets a lot larger and therefore populations potentially diffuse out,
right,
which makes it harder to fish then. So does that play a role in potentially
the resilience?
Yeah, the resilience.
Like yeah,
the catches go down. And
that's a good point. So there's sort of a Mother Nature imposes a sort of no fishing season every year, where even if you want to go out and harvest, you're not going to have much luck.
Yeah.
That's a good point. So that is a component of part of what I think makes them resilient. A good example is in Africa. I spent a year on the Upper Zambezi. Right after I got my PhD, I got a fellowship, and my wife and I went to Africa and studied the Upper Zambezi floodplain. And it's very interesting there, the indigenous people have this seasonal migration of their own where they go out onto the floodplain and they have their traditional village location on the floodplain in the dry season, and they fish like crazy, and they take their cattle with them to graze out there. And then when the flood comes, they have to get out. They go to the margins of the floodplain and they have their settlements there. So when it's flooded, they can't catch many fish. I mean, maybe they get a few here and there, but it's just too hard to find them. And I thought, wow, this system is really resilient, and I thought exactly what you're thinking, like this must be the reason why. But then in the years since, my colleagues in South Africa have gone back there recently, and they said it's changed from when you were there. Because there were so many fish. When we were there, there were big fish. I mean, it was amazing. Like, this is awesome. Like, they're not over harvesting. This is how we ought to do things. And now it's over harvested. The fishing down has happened.
Is that because there's more people, or they figured?
Yeah, well, not so much more people, but more people from outside coming into the region to fish, which never occurred before. So fish are being marketed outside. It's the way of the world, right? I mean, unfortunately. It's hard to find places anymore where there's like lightly harvested stocks and you can find big fish. Few and far between these days.
Time for one more.
All right.
Unless someone else wants to.
All yours?
Yeah, I was just thinking about your biomass ratcheting hypothesis and relationship between biomass and the size of the fish. And in terms of like metabolic theory of ecology, you might expect that biomass, if you have more small fish, you would have less total biomass. Is that something that plays into that at all? Have you thought about it? Because the metabolic rate of smaller fish is higher per gram what weight or
Per gram.
Yeah. So they need more food, but they only produce.
Yeah, we actually use metabolic theory in our individual-based model because there's a lot of metabolism functions in there that govern growth and everything. So we had to have some rules for fish size. And we're not actually simulating species per se, but functional traits that define what we're calling species in the model. And then of course we're trying to match them to the species in the real system. So that's a good point. Yeah, I'm sure it's a factor, and the model may let us play with that a little bit.
But it's in your model. Like body size is in your model. And
it is.
Between body
and
size
metabolism
and food requirements. Basically.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and we could probably test some ideas with respect to that.
Thanks.
Yeah, the idea with the model is we'll build it based on the Paraná system where we have a lot of data. But where we really need a model like that is a system like the Mekong, which I'll talk about tonight, so I don't want to spoil it, but among other systems, where they have a lot of dams going in. This is happening right now. There's a boom in hydroelectric dam construction in the tropics. We've already done it in this part of the world, right? Not really building any new dams these days, but we've already done it. But they're just getting going down there. So, all right.
Great.
Awesome.
Thanking Dr. Winemiller.
Thanks for coming.